In 2009, Electronic Arts and DICE ventured into uncharted territory with a bold and fun experiment, a free-to-play cartoonish spin-off from their acclaimed Battlefield series. This game was called Battlefield Heroes, and it aimed to bring the thrill of large-scale warfare to a broader, more casual audience. It included a fun, cartoon, and third-person style which up to that point had not really been implemented in any Battlefield game. At its core, Battlefield Heroes was born out of the desire to create a more accessible version of the traditional Battlefield game. Unlike its predecessors, such as Battlefield 2 in 1942, it focused on light-hearted third-person gameplay, which was designed to be fun, approachable, and accessible for players of all skill levels. One of the most striking aspects of Battlefield Heroes, looking at it in retrospect, was its business model. It was one of the first, if not the first, major title to adopt an entirely free-to-play model, and relying on microtransactions for its primary revenue. Players could buy an infinite number, basically, of customization options, such as new outfits, weapons, weapon skins, etc., and in the course of doing that, creating a game that was incredibly customizable and also quite competitive. In many ways, the success of later games like Fortnite, Call of Duty, and any number of other games that had paid cosmetics as part of their model all kind of owe their success to Battlefield Heroes for really getting that particular ball rolling. Of course, for as much innovation as it brought to the game, it also did come with a laundry list of significant issues, which we will dive into as this review progresses. Battlefield Heroes offered players three distinct classes: the soldier, the gunner, and the commando. And each of these had, of course, their unique abilities, the sorts of roles that they would tend to play, and they gave the game a certain amount of replayability. A lot of games, particularly Battlefield 2, would have significantly more classes in play, but you did have a fair amount of diversity in terms of what you could do with each of these classes. One of the key draws for getting people into the game was its sense of humor. It was also one of the first games, at least one of the first that I can remember, that really had emotes as being a core part of the user experience, which I think helped build its early popularity a great deal. Battlefield Heroes had a thriving forum scene, a lot of community events, and a lot of player-driven community events. To speak on one or two of these, how many of us remember the Nations Cup that we would have between like 2010 to maybe 2014 or so, I think was the last year that we did it? That was as close as we got to actually having a Battlefield Olympics, which I always enjoyed. Just in the course of doing research for this video, going back and looking at the old recorded matches we had, the Team US had against Portugal. There were a couple of other recorded ones where the file got corrupted, but I've got matches against Germany on there as well. Possibly one against Hungary, but I don't remember. It really united the game in a way that I have not experienced in almost any other online shooter. One of my favorite memories, and this group of people will come up at the end because I have a long list of shout-outs to give and commendations to give. But the Battlefield Heroes community in Australia are some of my absolute favorite people that I ever had the chance to play with. And I remember one particular instance, I want to say it was the summer of either 2011 or 2012, and I'm going to go with 2012. In order to have a fair match between Australia and I want to say Poland, the place which had the middle, which would have been the middle ground for each of them having equally poor ping, actually was the West Coast. And I remember staying up until about 2 in the morning my time in order to facilitate that. But it was such a great memory for me and such a key part of what makes this community great. Having the weekly video of the week or video of the month contest was always fun. You got to see the full breadth of humor that Battlefield Heroes could produce. And for as many problematic members of the community as there were even more wonderful members of the community who were constantly trying to make it better, to welcome new players in, and just continue to make it such a unique gaming experience. And, as much as it wasn't just about winning, even though winning is fun, it was about the memories that you made along the way, as cheesy as that might sound. The game did not take itself too seriously, and that is what made it unique, but it also made the intense amount of competition that would inevitably come up that much funnier. We had a lot of epic battles, and we'll get into some of the classic Battlefield Heroes drama later on. But there were also some moments that you really just couldn't replicate. I mean, how many times did we collectively, get 2 or 3 soldiers and just blast a tank, out in the middle of Buccaneer Bay just because we could? You could pick on one person on the enemy team, especially if you knew them, because we're going to talk about that too later on. There was just a lot that you could do with the game, and for as basic a premise and as basic and kind of rudimentary as some of the gameplay was at times, I never really got tired of playing it right up until maybe the last 6 months before the game was taken offline, and then my passion for it really kind of cratered, which I think it did for a lot of people. The pay-to-win model, or rather the microtransaction model, really let us down, especially when it came to a lot of the guns that they were adding that were only purchasable with real money. And I say this as somebody who invested a lot of real-world money into the game. Certainly not as much as others, who will remain nameless, but definitely dropped a couple grand there over the course of the 5 or 6 years that I played the game. But before I get too much further, Battlefield Heroes can be roughly broken up into several periods of time. There's the early stage, which would include the closed beta, so starting in 2008 and going until early 2009. There would be what's called I would classify as the intermediate period, which would be like 2009 to 2010, maybe the beginning of 2011. And that would be where it really started to find its footing. By that point, another map had been released besides the core 4 that were released, and there were starting to be more of these community events. I mentioned the Nations Cup earlier. There was the first one of those, I believe, in 2010, and then, again, proceeding up to like 2014 or 15. And that was just the biggest one. There were probably hundreds of other community-driven events. There were gunner tournaments, soldier tournaments, sniping competitions. The list goes on. There were just a ton of content available for people that wanted it, and it was lovely. One of the funnier things about Battlefield Heroes in hindsight is how absolutely cutthroat the competitive scene could be at times. Obviously, the bulk of my competitive experience was in the North American scene, which is, I won't say the largest, but it certainly had a lot of very vocal people in it. And obviously, Europe has its own, or had its own, very thriving scene, and I made some really wonderful friendships, both in the American scene, the European, the Australian scene, and the LATAM scene, for that matter. I was really fortunate and kind of, I hate to use the word blessed, but I really was blessed in that I got to meet so many interesting people. I've always, when we released the montage for Beast 2, the collaborative video that I did with Amcor, who also is going to get a shout out if he hasn't already, because that guy can play like nobody's business. But when I released that, the editor was Yan, who I want to say is based in Brazil, and just you get to touch on so many different walks of life and so many different types of folks. It really was a wonderful time. Not that there weren't occasionally some bad eggs, but by and large, there were a lot of really good people, and the game really did its best to highlight a lot of their strengths. Unfortunately, despite its initial success and loyal fan base, Battlefield Heroes did face a multitude of challenges. The gaming landscape had evolved, and the free-to-play market had actually grown quite competitive in terms of what was getting released. And over time, the player base did decline. And finally, in 2015, Electronic Arts announced that they would in fact be shutting down the servers. And as much as it pains me to say this, that was probably the right thing to do. I would have loved for them to fix the game, but in practice they were never going to do that on their own and have it be a game that was something that would be worth us continuing to play. There were some definite systemic flaws at EA that would have made whatever version they changed it to probably problematic. And since then, of course, there have been a couple of revival attempts, most notably Revive Heroes, which I've made a few videos for, and I would like to actually make more, but it's just very difficult to find a game now, unfortunately. Renegade Line was another one, which I don't think at the time of recording it that it's actually been released, and I'm not entirely sure that it ever will, but that would have been the other big comparison. And where does that leave us then? Ultimately, Battlefield Heroes closing was in fact the end of an era, but just not the one that we thought it was. Battlefield Heroes was a pretty unique experiment that didn't just influence its contemporaries, but it also really shaped how we look at free-to-play titles today. I mentioned Fortnite earlier, and that is a game that is, of course, free-to-play, at least the multiplayer component is, but they make their money entirely on cosmetics, which they produce at an alarming rate. And it's also true for games like Apex Legends, for, pick your Call of Duty of choice, Destiny. Like, a lot of games and a lot of studios have picked up on this model as being viable. And of course, EA has done it with a host of other games. But at the same time, I think that Battlefield Heroes is still going to be my favorite of those. Its closure did really mark the end of one particular chapter in kind of the overall history of online gaming. And that might sound ostentatious, but I do genuinely believe that to be true. You can look at the list of games that followed it, and you can see little elements of Battlefield Heroes in there. And going back even further, you can see elements of games like Team Fortress 2, Counter-Strike to some degree. Like, there are elements of other things within Battlefield Heroes. It's not a fully unique concept, but a lot of games, I think, trace their bones back to Battlefield Heroes, and I think that is a really unique and beautiful legacy in its own way. And sadly, while Battlefield Heroes may no longer be playable, its legacy will live on. It paved the way for so many other games and really highlighted how valuable the fun and more casual experience could be, especially when you juxtapose that against something more serious like Battlefield 3, which came out in 2011, or any of these more modern games, more modern shooters, I should say, that are a little bit more rooted in reality. I would hesitate to say that either the Battlefield series or Call of Duty are rooted in reality, but at the very least, they're done in a realistic style. And for those who played, Battlefield Heroes will always hold a special place in our collective gaming memory. And it certainly does for me. I would not be who I was or who I am without it. I owe a great deal to the game and ultimately to what I was able to do with the game for YouTube as a platform. Really kind of an emotionally important game for me in a way that a lot of others haven't been. I have made, as I mentioned earlier, I've made so many good friendships, many of whom I still speak to, even though it's been now about almost a decade since Battlefield Heroes went offline, and I still talk to some folks. And that's the sort of thing that you just can't find in every game. Battlefield Heroes really proved that you could take like a well-known franchise, put a twist on it, and create something new, and it would actually work. Like, it was, in a way, it was a very courageous demonstration of what gaming could be that I kind of wish EA and some of these larger publishers would go back to. I think it's kind of a damning indictment of the gaming industry as a whole that we've increased the funding on how much it takes to actually produce a game, and everything has to be an equation. Everything has to add up to a certain amount of ROI, return on investment. And that is a problematic element, which as gaming studios have become more corporate and more business focused and less about the art, I think that that's an issue that we're going to have to address again. And while the game itself certainly has not been perfect, it was innovative, it left its mark, and even now, 10 years later, I'm still humming that theme tune when I'm doing my laundry. And that's the sort of iconic creation that you just can't replicate as easily anymore. For my part, I thought I'd talk for a little bit about my journey through Battlefield Heroes, which might not be of interest to many of you, but I think that it's an important story in its own way because I think it illustrates just one example of many of how Battlefield Heroes kind of struck a chord. I began playing in May of 2009, just after the game had entered its open beta phase. And I was hooked almost immediately, which was really awful at the time. Not because the game was awful, but because I was trying to do my senior year of high school. And I had a hard time because I really, really got stuck into the game. But eventually, in 2010 rolled around, I went off to college, and I realized that my laptop had a video editor built in. Not a good one, but enough of one that I could record some very basic and very choppy gameplay. The first video that I ever put out was one of the worst edited things, and it all got better from there, to be fair. But it wasn't until my second year of college, when I got a new computer, that actually could play Battlefield Heroes at a gorgeous frame rate, and I could record with basically no loss, that I was like, there's something to be done here. I really wasn't... There was a lot of good content, but I felt like there was a niche to be explored a little bit, in terms of actually educating people. If you go back and look at a lot of my earlier videos, or really a lot of the mid-period ones as well, a lot of them are just tutorials. How do you aim? How do you rocket jump? How do you exert dominance on a particular map? How do you clan war? I really wanted to emphasize the fact that anybody could and can pick up the game. It just requires a little bit of application and a little bit of time. And that's one of the big reasons which drove my channel, and part of the reason why I'm currently in a master's program for education right now, is so much of education is about accessibility and desire, and giving people the access and then kind of doing my best to infuse the desire kind of go hand in hand. But I definitely experienced the peak of my channel between the fall of 2011 and probably the end of 2013. That was a period of time in which I was producing content at kind of an alarming rate. It was something like 1 or 2 videos, like every couple of days it felt like. I remember I would do what I would call mammoth sessions, where I would record I would play the game for like 4 or 5 hours on a weekend, and I would record, I don't know, maybe 12 matches, like a ridiculous number of matches, and then I would go back, watch them, and pick like 3 or 4, and that would be the content for that week. It was really efficient for a while, but of course that you end up playing a lot of Battlefield Heroes, which ultimately isn't the best for your mental health, but anyway, I digress. It was a really wonderful time for me. I really felt like I was contributing to something bigger. I loved playing the game. I loved interacting with people. And it was during that time, probably would have been, like 2010, early 2010, I think, is when I joined my first Battlefield Heroes clan, which ended up being the Hi-Hats organization. We'll say a really eclectic group. I definitely met some really wonderful people there who would ultimately follow me into Imperfect Gaming, which is the clan that I founded. Also some not very good people. And if there was to be a place for dishonorable mentions, I would probably highlight those people here. Some legitimately unpleasant folks who don't belong around anyone. They should just kind of isolate themselves. And it was later on, at the beginning of 2011, that began to fall apart. There was a number of instances of drama that was really... Some of it was, for lack of a better word, racially charged. The owner of the clan in question, who I'm not going to name, said some awful things, frankly, and it put a lot of us off. So the clan kind of splintered then, and I was going through a particularly awful breakup at the time. It was like, time for a clean break. I'm making my own thing. And that's how Imperfect Gaming came about. Imperfect Gaming started in probably would have been March or April of 2011, and we were able to build that into something quite formidable. Far and away one of the finest, certainly one of the best gaming clans for Battlefield Heroes in North America. I don't think anybody can really lay claim to the best because there's no good way to compare apples and oranges, but truly a delightful time. As good as Imperfect was, it was not without its own share of drama. There were a number of American clans that, like the Hi-Hats, who resented me after I left, and went out of their way to target me whenever I would arrive in a server that they happened to be in. Of course, because of who was left at the time, the roster was complete shit, and they got demolished frequently and with great enthusiasm. There was one notable instance, which you can find on this channel, of a particular Hi-Hat member. I joined their server, not intentionally. I was trying to play with somebody else, and there were a couple of Hi-Hats in there, and one of them just starts a vote kick, which was almost immediately shot down, which that by itself is kind of funny and more than a little embarrassing for them, but it never really got any better for them after that. I'll always think of that remaining cohort of old, sad people with a certain degree of revulsion and pity. Just absolutely gobsmackingly stupid stuff for grown-ass men to do. But that's okay. They still got time to learn, I suppose. Following that, the content did kind of shift, and it became more... There were tutorials, and there were still tutorials throughout, but it became a little bit more showy. As my time went on, I definitely produced more montages and clip compilations, because I'd reached the point where I could actually edit videos a little bit better on my own, and it wasn't just kind of dull or drunken commentary of me, narrating what's happening in front of you, because nobody loves that, as it turns out. In total, I ended up producing 7 full-length montages, of which 3 were edited by others, and of those 3, 2 won Video of the Week, number 175 and number 213, respectively. Both of the ones that won were my dualtages with Amcor CH, a player I respect incredibly, wonderfully easy guy to work with, very decent. If you're hearing this, buddy, I hope you're well. The other one was produced by Michael F. Rocks, who I can't say enough good things about. He actually produced the first official one, Equilibrium, with a wonderful use of the white stripes. And I don't watch them often, but in preparing for this video, I did watch pretty much all of them, just to kind of refresh my memory, and let me tell you, there's something about the nostalgia hit and the dopamine that you get from watching some of those old highlights. Really is quite wonderful in its own way. Battlefield Heroes was the first of the freemium model games that Electronic Arts produced, with Battlefield Play for Free, Need for Speed World, and FIFA World following. Yeah, remember those? Neither do I. I had to dig through the memory well to even find anything on them. Although, I do remember playing Battlefield Play for Free and getting charged $15 for a gun. And I would say that that's what a time to be alive, but oh good God, what a terrible concept. You know, guys, let's talk about something important. Something that has been eating at my soul for the last 10 years, and I think it's time for that to finally come out. Let's talk about the official ranking for Battlefield Heroes maps. Yes, that Battlefield Heroes. You know, the one that ended in 2015. Because that's the sort of timely content that we're trying to create here. In total, there were 13 maps released by the time Battlefield Heroes shuttered its servers, and 3 game modes by my count, of which the best is quite obviously the classic Conquest. King of the Hill was kind of a fun idea. Capture the Flag is a fun idea, but ultimately people came for Conquest and stayed for Conquest. That is a hill that I will die on, and I will not be taking questions at this time. However, this is where it gets interesting, because the actual ranking for which maps are best is probably a fairly contentious topic, although I suspect that if we were to put this to a vote, there would definitely be a defined top 3 in terms of best maps, and then the rest would probably rank somewhere below that. So I'm going to do my very best to give you my unbiased ranking. I'm going to do my very best to give you my unbiased ranking, and I'm going to try and give you a little bit of a reason why certain maps ended up where they did. And we will start at the very bottom, because otherwise there would be no point for this ranking. And that would actually go to what I think was the last one released. I want to say it was Inland Invasion. And the only reason that it's this it's this low, I feel like it came so late in the development cycle that people just weren't getting out there and playing it. I feel like I never played a full match on Inland Assault. It was almost always like a 4v4, which for a map that big really sucks. I really love the concept. The one thing I will say is it overwhelmingly favored the defenders, and you can go and find clips. I definitely have some recorded Inland Invasion gameplay, but a single sniper or 2 that were quite good could very easily pin down large swaths of the enemy team if you weren't careful. So that one is going to come in the last position. Following it, I would probably put Lunar Landing here. I really love the concept, and the low gravity actually is a really fun twist. Unfortunately, I think the map is just a little bit too big, and this is another one where I feel like it was actually very rare to play a game with a full 8v8. I really enjoy it. The aesthetic is great. Whenever they were able to use those rocket models, I always thought that was cool. A lot of really interesting angles to attack and defend on this map. But unfortunately, it was too little too late. And you may notice, you'll definitely notice it with the next one, but a lot of the more recent maps, unfortunately, go toward the bottom, and I think if the community had had more time to play them, they would probably rank a little bit higher. The only one that I'm really dead set on is Inland Invasion, is definitely last. Followed by Lunar Landing, and coming up next is Fortress Frenzy, a map that I actually really love, but this one suffers from probably being just a shade too large. In separation from its predecessors, though, it was not hard to find a full 8v8 on this map for me. I feel like that was pretty easy. You got some really good fights. But also, it's hard to say. It did not make a lasting impression on me, and unfortunately, it was also somewhat difficult. For as many full 8v8 matches, there were a lot of people who would leave if this map came up on the rotation. So you did kind of have to plan around it a little bit, and occasionally we would get a really good game going if we had, 2 full teams of 8. Kind of pre-made teams, though. So you couldn't really rely on randos in the way that you might want to. Coming up after that, though, I would probably put Wicked Wake. I don't, generally speaking, love the more vehicle-centric maps, even though vehicles are obviously a key component of Battlefield Heroes. This one is kind of a paradox because on the one hand, it's one of the few maps, actually might be the only map, where we get a tropical theme, which I think is a wonderful choice. But it's also really big. And for certain players, particularly ones that like to use planes, it could take you a very long while to get places. You could expose yourself to danger by driving in a Jeep and getting there quickly, and then you could get yourself blown to bits by an errant pilot. I feel like games on Wicked Wake tended to take a very long time, and this is one where it absolutely needed to be an 8v8 for it to be a viable and quick match. Trying to do a 4v4 on Wicked Wake is an exercise in disaster and frustration. Just not... It, again, needed to be slightly smaller. Following up on that... it probably in practice is like a two-way tie, but I'm going to say Perilous Port is here, with Alpine Assault being just above it. But we'll talk about Perilous Port first. This is one of the ones that was added kind of in the midway point of Battlefield Heroes. I want to say that it was added in maybe 2012 for the first time. And I actually really love this map. I love the ones where it's basically... I want to say it was either a 3-flag or a 5-flag map. I think it was 3. But basically people fighting over that middle point. You had the bridge and the boat and that little channel. And you had the two like little bits of high ground on either side of the channel so you could get your sniper cover. There were a lot of really great fights that happened on those docks and in the back kind of garden areas here. Really great map. I don't really have a lot of negatives to say about it. Following that, though, is Alpine Assault, and this one I might get a little bit of flack for. I really love the design. I particularly love the wintry version of Alpine Assault, because that actually feels like, you know, like fighting in the Ardennes or something kind of historical. Obviously, it could lead to tank spam if you weren't particularly careful. But I feel like this map, more than some of the other larger ones, did a better job of managing its space. There were a lot of really good battles between the sawmill and whatever that other flag was that was basically... I think it was on the bluff that looked down at the sawmill, or like slightly behind that. A lot of really good fights there, and I felt like that was a really good concept of a map. Following that, though, definitely Sunset Showdown. Sunset Showdown, it's tough to say. On the one hand, really large map. Even for 8v8, that was quite large. The vehicle gameplay could get really frustrating, especially if you had, like, one cheeky pilot who goes over to murk the initial fighters that spawn, which definitely happened, and I say this as somebody who often played the role of the cheeky pilot doing just that. But that's how you would screw up the enemy team, and ultimately that's how you would win. The fights around the Churchill were classic and remain so. And the fights to retake the Churchill, once one team had inevitably gotten its ass kicked, were also great. Unfortunately, though, like with many of the vehicle-centric maps, it really wasn't one that got a lot of competitive play. And most of those maps are coming later in this ranking. So that's where we put Sunset Showdown. Following that, or rather slightly ahead of that, I would put Seaside Skirmish. And I'm willing to bet that a lot of people are going to be surprised that that is as high as it is. I think the reason it's as high as it is because if you ignore two of the flags, namely the National Spawn and the Royal Spawn, the actual fighting between like the lighthouse and the bottom of that street, there's a lot of good quality brawls to be had. There's just kind of the fighting in between the little walls that you could jump over, kind of ducking in between houses, ledges. There was gunner gameplay for people flying off the roof off the lighthouse. if there are plenty of things to knock about Seaside Skirmish, but I can't really knock that. If anything, it is a map that is once again too large. But there is a part of me that kind of likes it for what it is. It's such a key part of the trailers that Battlefield Heroes actually released with, and clearly the developers thought a good deal of it because, I mean, you just look at how much footage there is of it. But it's going to go in the number 5 spot, and I think that that's about and realistically it could probably go a little bit lower, but I don't think it can go higher than 5. Following up on that, I would probably put Buccaneer Bay. Of the vehicle maps, this one feels probably the most, I don't want to say the most balanced, but I think the number of vehicle spawns you get and the fact that you have the back non-flag spawns as well means you're pretty much never going to have to walk anywhere. You're going to always have an option to use a Jeep if you need to, or a plane, or a tank. They all spawn pretty quickly. But also, the battle between the shipwreck and the town, like, there's so many different ways to get into the town. You've got all of these ledges around the ship and around the town that people can snipe from. There's so much replayability there, and it's what makes the map so good. It's really one of those maps where there is something there for everybody. If you like the vehicles, you can go here for that, and you can actually interact with the infantry as opposed... Not that some people didn't take a tank and camp on that one hill right by the town, but if you want to engage in vehicle-on-vehicle combat, you can. If you want to dogfight, you can. If you want to shoot down planes, you can. It's got a little bit of everything for everybody. So I think putting that in the number 4 spot makes a lot of sense. I don't think it would go much higher than that in my ranking, but I can definitely understand why people would have a very nostalgia-positive version of this. And now we're in the top 3. And the real question is, in what order are they going to be in, right? Because there's only 3 left, and they are almost definitely some of the most popular maps. But the number 3 spot is going to go to Riverside Rush. Obviously, I have a preference for... Not that I don't enjoy vehicles from time to time, but I prefer infantry. I think that's the most dynamic and the most fun. And Riverside Rush has that in spades. It is probably the best sized map that they released, or if not the best, like in the top 2. I feel that it is the perfect size for an 8v8. You never feel like you're out of the action for more than probably 15 seconds tops, because that's about how long it will take you to walk from wherever you spawn in the back all the way up to the front line, which I appreciate. It's very easy to have, like... You got angles for getting over. You can rocket jump if you get in the trench. You can... Obviously, you've got the bridge. You've got the staircases. You've got multiple ways of going and capturing flags. And this one saw a fair amount of competitive play. It really is a well-balanced map. Perfect 4 flags. Obviously, there's going to be a danger of some spawn camping, but... yeah... Just some really good stuff. You'll also notice I haven't really talked much, except for Alpine Assault, about the other weather variants or the night variants of these maps. And honestly, I think that, well, those are... I wouldn't call them gimmicks, but they're like gimmick adjacent. They don't really improve or take away from the experience of the map. They're just kind of there. The winter variants are kind of fun just because you get the snow particle effects, or what DICE and EA would like us to believe are snow particle effects. But that's okay. And that leaves us with the top 2. Now, I think if you were to pull probably the bulk of Battlefield Heroes folks, you'd probably get Victory Village in that number 1 spot, and I'm actually going to do a zigzag here. Victory Village is going to be my number 2, even though it's like a 51-49 decision. Victory Village is like the quintessential competitive map. Like, you can't... Pretty much every competitive match I've ever played has had at least 1 game on Victory Village. And it's easy to see why. In terms of flags, all of the flags are basically perfectly placed. And you can have fights on pretty much every alley, and it will lead to something significant. Like, the or the first national flag that you cap, the roadblock, that, or not the roadblock, is it guardhouse? I forget the name of the first one, but you can fight from there to the churchyard, you can fight from there to the roadblock, you can fight between the back royal spawn to the church, to the roadblock. It offers so much. And it's very easy to get around. Lots of angles for snipers, lots of places to rocket jump, lots of great angles for soldiers to use blasting strike. You can look online at how many different Mickey strategies there are for getting people in the water. It's just... I don't have enough good things to say about it. But I think the reason why I put Coastal Clash ahead of it, and I'm going to go ahead and pivot to Coastal Clash now, I feel like there's a little bit more strategy at play with Coastal Clash. I think that because there's a little bit more space, and the space is a little bit emptier, it actually makes it a little bit harder to get a tactical victory on Coastal Clash. So, obviously you have the windmill flag, you've got the lookout flag, and then you have the two back spawns. And in between windmill and lookout, you have essentially a giant... You've got the little gully, and you've got water in it. You can fight between that, and many people did. You can also fight on the slopes, on the slopes leading up to lookout. You can fight on the bridges leading up to the windmill. There are plenty of strategies for royals to go basically cap windmill and then immediately book it to the back national spawn and kind of get a 3-1 flag advantage that way. In a way that you can't quite do on Victory Village. But you can also... There's just a lot of permutations. I think Coastal Clash probably more than Victory. There are more jeep routes and more kind of fun quirks you can do with that. I think that Coastal Clash also makes better use of... Maybe not better use of vertical space, but what you can do with it is a little bit more creative. So, for example, on Coastal Clash, it's really just the national side that has the high houses, like immediately between the national back spawn and the lookout and windmill flags. And then if you go over to the royal side, well, all the houses are a little bit shorter, there's not as much cover. It's just a different look. And in Victory Village, they're basically all the same size, largely. Like, they're at least a story tall. There's not a lot of tree cover. Like, there is some, but Coastal Clash definitely has more. And Coastal Clash also has these long sequences where it's just a fence providing a lot of cover. So it forces you to position better and take advantage of the few times that your opponent does show themselves. Having said all of that, it really is like a 51-49 decision. Like, when either of those comes up in a rotation, I'm going to be overjoyed to play it, because those are just, like, top-tier maps. And that's my unofficial personal preference ranking of Battlefield Heroes maps. I certainly don't expect a lot of people to agree with that ranking, but that is what I'm going with. If I had to rank game modes, I would say Conquest is definitely at the top, and then King of the Hill, and then Capture the Flag. And I'm realizing now I did actually omit a map, which was Midnight Mayhem. So the honorable mention for Midnight Mayhem, I would actually slot that in at 5, and we would put Seaside Skirmish at 6. Midnight Mayhem is perfectly sized. It's a wonderful map to play in competitive. Let's see. Also a really fun one during the Nations Cup. In preparing for this, I did watch the match that we played against Portugal, which was also on this map. I think it was one of the only times where a commando got played in the Nations Cup, which is kind of funny. But Midnight Mayhem definitely deserved a mention, and I was remiss in not looking at that earlier. But I was reminded when I looked at the King of the Hill game mode. But yes, Conquest is definitely first, then King of the Hill, and then Capture the Flag. Capture the Flag was very good in principle, but it wasn't on enough maps for it to matter enough to me. So that's why it comes in last. And that is my unofficial ranking of Battlefield Heroes maps. So I would love to hear your comments and thoughts on this particular section. And as always, it's been a pleasure, and take care. No Battlefield Heroes retrospective would be complete without a long list of the people to whom I am indebted for making the game fun and tolerable for being wonderful teammates and wonderful human beings. So I'm going to read a list of them, and I'll have the list displayed on here as well. In no particular order, because this was more in order of recollection. A huge shout out and thank you to Ace Borlag, Grap, G Beastie, Kunj, Coco, Indignant, Maligno, Scissor, Marine, Arrow, Timmy, Amcor, Crazy, Michael F. Rocks, Bidding, everybody in the Imperfect clan. There were a lot of really wonderful people there. There are also a lot of people that I was never in a clan or a group with in an official capacity, but whose paths I crossed with enough, and I had a good enough relationship with them, so I'm going to call them out as well. Also Willoughby from the Imperfect clan, lest I forget. Bobby Ray, Tipsy Tommy, Javi Cruz, Black Leader, Sick of School, Chargers Beast, Fear My Cheese, Stupidus, Zale, Joey, Taste GW, Caveman 2006, Nathaniel, Duffman ASU, almost everybody that I interacted with from the Australian Nations Cup team. We're all really wonderful folks. Can't say enough good things about you. As far as dishonorable mentions go, there have been a number of high-profile cheaters in this game for whom there can be little mercy. Perhaps the biggest dishonorable mention of all just goes to Electronic Arts for monetizing this game into the ground, driving away its player base, exacerbating its wonderful content creators, and generally speaking, screwing up a good thing. If this game had been properly nurtured, I think it would be in the same conversations as games like Fortnite, in terms of that casual shooter, cartoony experience. But unfortunately, we get to talk about it in videos like this, which are both a wonderful celebration of a really good thing and also, in many ways, a judgment of what could have been done differently. And I'm not going to get into the DICE and Electronic Arts debate because this really isn't the vehicle for that. This video isn't the vehicle for that. You could certainly spend a great deal of time trying to litigate whose fault it was that the game ended up this way. And that's not what this is about. This is a retrospective and trying to trace kind of how the game went. So, in conclusion, I know that this is definitely going to be in the longer term of videos that I've made, and that may be off-putting to some folks. I hope it isn't. I definitely did write a script for this, but there are points where obviously it isn't going to be scripted because I just got a little overwhelmed. I had a lot to say on a certain topic, and you'll just have to deal with that, I guess. But, as always, it has been a pleasure. I'm hoping to get back into the content creation scene. I've missed it. The divorce has been exceedingly heavy on my mental health, and I want to get back to it because it was really good for me to do that mentally, to make content. So, with that being said, I wish you all the best in health, both mental and physical. I wish you great success in your years, both personally and professionally, and take care of yourselves and each other. Be well.